So, Lone Rider here, and thinking about the video I recently saw where an English cyclist posted what was basically a very brief public service announcement, essentially saying, here, look, this is an example where I had a near miss with somebody who was on a cell phone and wasn't paying attention and stepped out into traffic without, looking. Don't be that person. That's not safe. And one of the things that I noticed was that the video itself was relatively mundane, but the responses of almost all the people commenting it, literally like 201, were to denounce the cyclist for pointing out the unsafe conduct of the distracted person on the cell phone, and therefore essentially defend the person on the cell phone. And I put a lot of this down to the fact that these people, I mean, if you think about it, when you have somebody engaging in bad conduct, in bad faith, something that everybody should know, is bad, but they're doing it anyway, and then you have people who defend it, whether it's driving drunk, whether it's talking on the cell phone while you're driving, whether it's being on the cell phone and throwing yourself into traffic like a flying squirrel. The point is that who defends conduct like that? Usually people who are of a similar mindset, either in terms of their approach to life or in terms of the things they're actually doing. Who defends a drunk driver? Well, usually other drunk drivers. Who defends people who are careless on the cell phone? Usually other people who are careless on the cell phone. And to them, it may strike very close to home. This very brief video basically showing this incident and saying, don't be like this person, pay attention, be safe. I would have thought that's a sentiment that almost nobody could find fault with. And yet, every single person responding to the video found fault with it in terms of criticizing the cyclist and therefore attempting to use that to defend the conduct of the pedestrian without ever actually coming out and saying, acting like a zombie and throwing yourself into traffic without looking is a good thing. But that's essentially what they were saying by how they were defending it, by criticizing the criticism of it. And I put a lot of that down to the fact that essentially these people were really reaching and trying really hard to try and justify their condemnation of the cyclist's criticism of this person's careless conduct. And the only thing I could put it down to was that they're probably careless people on cell phones themselves. I mean, who else defends a drunk driver except for other drunk drivers? Who else defends a careless boob on a cell phone except for other careless people on cell phones, right? Jerks stick together in that sense. And, if that's how you conduct yourself, if that's more importantly beyond the individual instance of conduct, if that's your overall philosophy of life, your approach to existence, that you can just go through life heedless of others, not obeying the basic norms and decorum that we all take for granted, yeah, you're going to really reach to defend it whenever anybody criticizes anybody else who acts the same way, because indirectly it's a criticism of you and it's an attack on you. Now, I think that's an attack that we should be making. I think that's, every chance we get to hammer this point home that this is not how you should act, we should do it, because these things aren't just a nuisance. They're a physical danger to other people. But nevertheless, looking at it, searching for a reason. Why would so many people go so out of their way to defend the indefensible, the careless, ridiculous actions of this stupid person? The only thing I could think of is that that's how they act, and they don't like the idea of somebody calling that idea out and saying, don't do that. But I think there may be more to it. And I just want to throw this out there as a suggestion. How we as a culture deal with pedestrian safety is very interesting. Almost universally, all recent attempts, and when recent I say, last 10, 20 years, to deal with the issue of pedestrians and their interaction with vehicles, whether you're talking bikes, cars, buses, mobile homes, Winnebagos, whatever. It seems that it's all focused on telling other people what to do to be careful of the pedestrians, and at the same time, it seems to be focused on telling the pedestrians, don't worry, we've told other people to look out for you, so you have absolutely no responsibility to act like a grown adult human being that's aware of their surroundings. And the problem is you're setting them up to fail. You're setting the pedestrian up to find themselves in a situation where they think they've acted as they should, but in reality, they've acted no different than a drunk or somebody on drugs or somebody who's mentally impaired, because essentially that's what they are. They're mentally impaired by their cell phone they're distracting themselves with. And so you've set up a situation where you think you're trying to make it safer for pedestrians, but you're neglecting half of the problem. Certainly there's a problem with vehicle operators, bicyclists, motorcyclists, car drivers, etc., not being careful of pedestrians. That's certainly true. But in a larger sense, you have a problem with pedestrians who are just generally clueless. And it's not just confined to cell phones. It's sometimes people aren't on a cell phone, they're just generally clueless, and they step out on the street. And the problem I see is there's always going to be bad actors and irresponsible people and people who don't want to grow the frick up. Excuse my French. And they're going to defend to the last what they think is their God-given right to act like a jerk, even at the expense of public safety. The reality, of course, is that, yes, you have a right to act like a jerk, but only where it doesn't threaten somebody else's physical well-being, right? I mean, when you get to the point that you're being a jerk isn't just an issue of how you live your life, but it's an issue of how you impact the lives and safety of other people, then it's no longer about you. It's about the other people whom you're endangering, right? If a person wants to go get crap-faced drunk at home, it's not good for them, but they can do it if they want. It doesn't hurt anybody. If they want to get crap-faced drunk and then get behind the wheel and go out in their car, no, then it becomes an issue for the rest of us and for the police, right? I mean, that's why these things are, against the rules, because they endanger other people. They pose a risk to the safety of others. And I understand. Nobody likes to be told that what they're doing is dumb or stupid or foolish or not wise or a menace to society and other road users everywhere. But if that's the actual case, dodging the acknowledgement of that because you don't want to be told that, well, the truth is you're an a-hole. I mean, nobody wants to be told they're an a-hole, but the point is, if that's the truth, does trying to dodge acknowledgement of that fact help anyone? You or the other people? No. But that said, I think that explanation that it's, jerks sticking together, people who engage in like conduct or have a similar worldview trying to defend it in another case, I think that only goes so far to explain why so many people are willing to defend careless and reckless conduct in terms of traffic interaction by distracted or impaired people, right? Part of it, I think, has to be, you have to look at how we treat the interaction of pedestrians and other people on the roads, and in particular, how we attempt to improve pedestrian safety. Almost all our attempts universally are to tell other people what to do about the pedestrians, slow, stop, yield, etc., but to say nothing to the pedestrians about their part in the equation, that yes, while everyone else has an obligation to be careful of you, you also have an obligation to be careful for yourself and for other people. And I think that's a huge problem. And I think it's contributing to this. And the danger is that, when you look at the number of people who, whenever there's a run-in between a careless pedestrian and a cyclist or a driver or somebody else on the road, there are plenty of run-ins, by the way, where pedestrians are endangered by careless vehicle operators, drivers, bikers, whatever. That does happen. It's a real thing, and it's a real safety issue, and it should be addressed. But the point is, it is being addressed. We're doing everything we already can to tell other people to be careful of pedestrians. But what we're not doing is we're not telling the pedestrians they also have to be careful. Not just for their own safety, but so they don't endanger other people. And the thing is, if you leap into the street, the roadway has an infinite number of moving variables, some of which are fast, big, heavy, dangerous. If you leap into the street, it's not just a question of that you're endangering yourself. It's that you're also endangering all the other people on the road from the interactions that you set in motion. If you jump into the road and a car has to swerve around you, Any number of things could happen. He could hit another car and injure the person in that car. He could crash into me on my bike. He could go off the road trying to swerve and avoid you and end up hitting some poor schmuck standing on the opposite street corner who's minding his own business and never hurt anybody. He could set in motion a multi-vehicle collision. If I'm on my bike and I swerve to avoid you, and then a car swerves to avoid me, and then he crashes into a bus and kills, 4 school children. This may sound like the kind of over-the-top, analytics that you saw in the movie Good Will Hunting, where the character was saying, well, what if this happens, and what if this happens, and what if this happens? But the reality is, unlike the example in Good Will Hunting, where somebody was taking a bunch of random hypotheticals and stringing them together just to sort of prove a point, these things are actual foreseeable instances that anybody should see coming as a possibility of what they're doing. If you enter the street disrupting the traffic dynamic needlessly, without warning, there's a whole bunch of bad things that can happen. There's not a single good thing that can happen. There's no way it ends positively for anybody. The only question is, how much harm are you going to do? There's no question that you're not going to do harm. And so, yes, we should certainly be encouraging the drivers of cars and the riders of bicycles and other people like that to look out for pedestrians. But the point is, we already are. What we're not doing is dealing with the other half of the equation, which is telling the pedestrians they also have to do their part, which is look and pay attention and be aware of the situation that they're entering into. And by not doing that, and in fact, by explicitly doing the opposite and then doing nothing to address the pedestrians half of the equation, it's like we're infantilizing the pedestrians. We're telling them that nanny government has looked out for you. Look, they put a sign, they painted a crosswalk, they did whatever. So you no longer have any obligation to own your own life and be responsible for your own safety, or worse, the harm you could pose to others. And yes, if a pedestrian collides with a car, his body is not going to hurt the driver inside the car or the passenger inside the car. Not directly. There may be some damage to the car, but it's going to be minor. However, what he could do is set in motion events that lead to somebody else being killed. And of course, he himself could be injured or killed, or herself. So there's the issue of direct harm, and then there's the issue of the harm that you're setting in motion by changing events. And I understand. A lot of people have essentially self-imposed attention deficit disorder because they're distracted by all these electronic devices or other things. They're trying to multitask. They're trying to do this. They've actually been sold a bill of goods by the cell phone industry that basically is encouraging them to utilize their phones every minute of every day and trying to tell them that this is the new normal and it's perfectly safe. Well, it's not, okay? And yes, I understand the cell phone companies are in business to make money. They're basically selling your time and your, whatever. They don't have any interest in your best interest or in the best interest of public safety. And that's where the rest of us come in, who might point out that these things are a problem. But the issue is every time somebody points out the dangerous behavior of a person distracted by a cell phone, they're always met with, well, but pedestrians have the right of way. Why didn't you just stop? Because it's not physically possible to, because you skipped over the whole right-of-way thing by just throwing yourself into traffic. Pedestrians have the right-of-way is a concept that actually exists to prevent dangerous situations by establishing an agreed-upon code of conduct that's socially or legally enforced. How does it work? Well, if you come upon a pedestrian who's in the act of crossing, you have to slow down and stop or yield if necessary, depending on the jurisdiction, to allow them to continue crossing so that you don't collide with each other. However, that's if the pedestrian is in the act of crossing, right? The whole concept of you yielding to them is if they're there for you to yield to. If they're nowhere to be found until they throw themselves out from behind a blind corner or off the curb or whatever, the whole issue of right-of-way is moot, because that's not what it was meant to apply to, and it can't physically apply anymore. The only issue is physics, which is in that panicked moment before a collision, can you manage to stop without hurting yourself or the pedestrian or anybody in the vicinity? And I got news for you. When you're talking about a bicycle or a motorcycle or any other two-wheeled vehicle, the issue isn't just can you stop before you crash into the object that's appeared in your path, or without losing control and going into a skid and then crashing into that object or anything else. The issue is also, are you going to fall? Because if you slam on your brakes on a two-wheeled vehicle, whether it's a bicycle or a motorcycle, you run the risk of falling to the ground and being injured in that, whether or not you crash into the ground before you end up hitting the pedestrian as you're in a skid trying to slam on your brakes. So there's the issue of the safety of the other people, not just the pedestrian safety. And this is a big thing. And it's, we as a society are fairly advanced compared to where we were years ago. We've made tremendous strides in medicine, in space travel, in communications and electronics and all sorts of things. But when it comes to understanding human behavior and what leads to what, I honestly think some of us are still stuck back in the dark ages. And the idea that I understand why the careless person who just wants to be a dumb jabone on their cell phone doesn't want anybody calling anybody out for being a dumb jabone on their cell phone. And they're going to try and defend that person by criticizing the conduct of the person who's pointing out that person's conduct was bad. If you have a cyclist or another pedestrian or whomever has a near miss with a careless person on a cell phone that nearly caused an accident, they're going to try and criticize the person who's pointing out that person on the cell phone was careless, because what they're defending is not just that careless pedestrian, but the whole conduct and modus operandi and way of looking at the world that person represents, which includes their own way of looking at the world. I get that. But as a separate issue from that, put that aside. How about what we're doing as a society to address the issue of pedestrian and vehicle interaction and the dangers that arise thereof? There's an increased incidence of pedestrians being hit by vehicles, whether it's through the fault of the vehicle operators, whether it's through the fault of the pedestrians, whether it's a mixture of both, whether some are just genuine accidents that aren't attributable to negligence of either party and just circumstance. The point is that this is a known problem. And in fact, I've seen newspaper articles. The Star Ledger, a major New Jersey newspaper a few years ago, had a big one, front page article, pedestrian deaths increase. This is something that everybody knows is an issue, but yet when it comes time to address it, all we can think is, we'll just do more to remind people that pedestrians are there. That only goes so far, because you're ignoring half of the equation. Yes, a lot of the problem is people who are not respecting pedestrians and not yielding to pedestrians, but a lot of the problem is also the pedestrians themselves and how they act when they enter the roadway or immediately before they do, which is they're not cognizant of the fact that, stepping off the sidewalk into the roadway, you're entering a different situation. You therefore have to change your behavior to adapt and survive. You have to be aware of that situation. And if you're aware of the situation of the roadway before you enter it, and the people on the roadway are aware that you may be there and may be crossing, then hopefully an accident or even a frightening near miss can be avoided. However, if you look at what happens after a near miss or after even an accident, a lot of times the tendency is just a knee-jerk denunciation of whoever it was that was involved that wasn't the pedestrian. And we need to stop using this juvenile, stupid Fisher-Price logic. Yes, pedestrians have the right of way. However, that's not a blanket check on being an arsehole. That's not a blanket check on a total lack of personal responsibility for your safety or the harm you may cause to others. And that's not a license to basically go through life causing mishaps. All right? The pedestrians have the right of way doesn't mean that you're the only person in the world and you have to have no responsibility for your own safety or that of others. And I think there's a reason that this misperception about what pedestrians have the right of way means has become such a big thing, used so often to defend the careless conduct of careless pedestrians, as well as being a legitimate point that is sometimes made when it comes to careless drivers or cyclists who aren't behaving properly around careful pedestrians. I think it's how we deal with the problem, and that it's incipient foolishness to think that the way the officials, the people in charge, the government, the people we look to try and set the legal parameters, that set the social parameters of what's acceptable, by setting the social parameters that way you can get in trouble for. that if their response is to ignore half the problem, focus only on the behavior of the vehicle operators and not also on the behavior and awareness of the pedestrians, that if their response is to ignore half the problem, that's what everybody else is going to do. And that's going to be seen as the way to look at this. And so you're going to have people who, whenever the issue comes up, actually make the problem worse by denying that half of it exists. All right? And I wanted to close by pointing out that I don't have a problem with pedestrians. When I'm not biking, a lot of the times I do walk for local trips. And I have been endangered, even hit by cars once. It was when I was in high school. I was walking my dog a few blocks from my house. I was doing everything properly, walking against traffic, off to the side, etc. A car slammed on its brakes without warning to make an unsignaled turn. Another car tried to take evasive action, ended up passing it illegally on the right because it basically left him no choice. That car ran me over at 40 miles an hour, and I was lucky to survive with a broken leg and some permanent injury. The driver, of course, then took off. It was a hit and run. So I learned at a very young age, about 16 or so, that even if you're a careful pedestrian obeying all the rules, you can still be in danger or killed or left to bleed out on the side of the roadway because somebody else or several somebodies setting up a dangerous situation are arseholes. With that mindset, it's amazing to me how many pedestrians aren't careful and expect everything to turn up rainbows and tulips and roses. Right? If you're being careful and you're obeying the rules, you can still get hurt. So why encourage a situation where people don't obey the rules? Where people don't stop and look before entering the street? Again, part of this may just be some people hate cyclists, so if it's a cyclist criticizing a careless pedestrian, they take his side. A lot of it may be, as I suggested, the people are careless cell phone users themselves, and they don't like the idea of that behavior being called out, and people trying to point out that that shouldn't be the norm, that that's actually reckless and asinine. But I think a large part of it is how we as a society generally address the issue of pedestrian safety. And we do it in such a way that we're ignoring the pedestrians part of the equation. So it's no surprise that basically there are people who will defend anything a pedestrian does, from the mundane to the insane, right? And the very idea, look both ways before you cross the street. We teach this to children. Toddlers know this. But somehow we forget it as adults. And, if you want to go out in public and be treated like a responsible adult, you have to act like one. Part of that is put the damn phone down and pay attention. If you can't be bothered to do that, it shouldn't be our problem. It's your problem. You're creating the dangerous situation. And yes, like I said, there are instances where drivers and other people operating vehicles are dangerous to pedestrians. But there are also many, many cases where pedestrians contribute to their own danger and the danger to others, and those are almost never addressed. Or when people attempt to address them, it gets dismissed because of this trap we've fallen into of how we look at the issue. And we have to look at it as it's a communal effort. It's a group effort. There are two sides to the equation. The people operating a vehicle have to be very careful because they're traveling faster with more momentum. They have to be more careful than somebody who's afoot, right? Because they're going faster and what they're doing is potentially more dangerous. However, a person on foot still has an obligation to maintain a basic level of care and awareness for themselves and the safety of others around them. And if we can't bring ourselves back on track to acknowledging that, we're never going to solve this problem. And this may become the new normal. And I don't know about you, I've got enough problems to deal with when I'm out and about, whether I'm walking, riding my bike, or driving my car, without having an increased incidence of everybody around me behaving like a lemming. All right? This is not a situation that benefits everybody. And the funny thing is, most people, if you ask them, are distracted people being dumbasses. Is that a problem? Is that a safety issue? Is that a nuisance? Everybody will agree that it's bad. The question is just how bad is it? It's not a question of is it good or bad. Everybody agrees it's bad. The question is it just a nuisance? Is it harmful? Is it actually a mortal danger? The question is only how bad is it, not whether or not it's bad. So it amazes me that we still haven't been able to address this issue. And the handful of people who I think believe it's their God-given right to go through life as jerks, endangering everyone around them, yes, obviously they're going to leap to the defense of every mind-addled person that's distracted by a cell phone, because they're essentially leaping to their own defense and the defense of their own conduct in the process. But I don't think that entirely explains this. I think part of it, like I said, is how society and in terms of policy and everything, we're just framing the issue. And we're framing the issue in terms of neglecting the pedestrians' half of the equation. And that's not good. That's not. How do you solve a problem if you ignore a good chunk of it? You can't. But that might explain why, things are just getting worse and this isn't getting addressed adequately. Why? Because, if it was getting addressed adequately, we wouldn't see newspaper headlines talking about the increased incidence of pedestrian fatalities and pointing out specifically, which they never used to do, that it's not just an incidence of distracted drivers and stuff, it's also an incidence of distracted pedestrians and careless pedestrians. We need to address the entirety of the issue. That does include careless people in cars and on bikes and so forth who aren't respectful of pedestrians. But it also includes pedestrians who aren't respectful of themselves or, more importantly, everybody around them. And, I think that the fact that we're not doing that explains a lot. Lone Rider out.